Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this BVL Emerging Low Voices episode that on exceptional grounds is being held this time through the Zoom technology. And we have the honor and the pleasure to be hosting for this episode the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross Delegation for the United Kingdom and Ireland, Dr. Philip Sperry. Philip, we have the pleasure to be knowing each other, so we can speak in the singular. We welcome you to the series. Would you like to say for our viewers a bit briefly, what does your role as head of the delegation entail?
Okay, well, thank you, Solon, and a real privilege to be with you. Quick introduction. Myself, I've been nearly 30 years, long time with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Most people would be thinking of us in being present in conflict zones and in difficult areas. So why in London? Now, I've been here for 2 years. It is what we call a diplomatic delegation. We actually have it in all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council states, UK, France, Russia, China, and US. The reason for having it, and the primary role is, of course, engaging across the United Kingdom government on issues that concern us. Of course, mostly issues related to conflict areas in the world, in carrying humanitarian messages, but also always advocating for the respect of international humanitarian law. But we also use London, for example, as a basis for some of our global communication with English-speaking press. And there's also an activity in the UK, but also in Ireland, very much also related to gaining support, basically fundraising as well. So there's quite a range of activities, including also the strong partnership with the British Red Cross. So that's maybe in a nutshell. I will not expand much more on this role. You might want to hear about other roles in the past as well.
Philip, behind you, we see that you have the global map. And my question would be now, how much do you think in a conflicting zone and in an era where we have polarization in the international community, how much do you think that the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross is a uniting role?
Well, I would, starting with the uniting role, I think what is very important for the listeners is to have a good understanding that a lot of what ICRC does, particularly related to its protection and assistance role, is based on the Geneva Conventions. For example, if you think about visiting prisoners of war, accessing civilians, but also the role as a neutral intermediary is something that the states have agreed upon. And if well implemented, one would hope that safeguarding or trying to safeguard a minimal degree of humanity across the world is something that also helps reuniting populations coming out of conflict. So in a way, I do believe that holding or trying or really fighting hard to keep a minimum of humanity around the world is something that should unite the world rather than divide. So I think in that sense, it does play an important role.
Philip, because you have an extensive experience, as we said, and we're going to refer in the continuation of the interview maybe to your different posts in the Middle East. My question would be, from your experience, how much do you think is it easy for an International Red Cross Committee member to actually win over the states and over the opposition of certain states to accept the delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross in their premises?
Well, actually, gaining trust of governments, but not only governments. I mean, operating in conflict areas actually requires obtaining the trust of all belligerents and fighting sides. So I would say there is not just a golden bullet to that. It is something that is acquired with very patient endeavors. It takes a long time to acquire trust, but actually it takes a second to lose it also. It is a very, I would say, very difficult task actually to do it. I think in our days now with growing divisions, it is not necessarily easier because the kind of tensions one sees, particularly in the multilateral field, makes it less easy, to have for the full international backing for some of the activities that we have. So we're even more dependent on persuading and proving our added value through the action on the ground. So I would say it remains a very difficult task. It was always, but it's probably even more difficult than in the past.
And all the skills that you mentioned, trying to convince the parties to accept the International Committee of the Red Cross, reminds us of the skills, maybe diplomatic skills, that you hinted upon in the first answer of yours about the fact that maybe the location of the International Red Cross Committee in London signals also diplomatic facet of the organization, which is important maybe to be underlined. I would like to ask, based on this diplomatic also facet, and given that we have a major conflict now, unfortunately, also in the Middle East, without naming particular countries, because you have served in the Middle East, I would like to ask you if generally you believe that the Middle East, as a geographical and geopolitical entity, has certain more difficult features when it comes to embracing the parties and when it comes to delivering the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Well, I think that anybody who is following the situation in the Middle East, not just the present but also in the past, sees that it's a very, very complex political environment and division. However, I would point out to the fact that the ICRC has very, very long term presence. If you take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 48 upwards, permanent presence there since 67. Gaza, West Bank, we have a presence, a delegation, a very important one in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan. I mean, actually, all the countries around with a very, very long presence. But obviously, with the escalation of the conflict since the 7th of October, but also kind of spreading across the region, of course, the difficulty in terms of scaling up one's operation, but also trying to convince to address a series of very delicate humanitarian problems is a level of challenge that we have not seen now for a very, very long time. So in that sense, we are currently facing a rather unprecedented situation in the Middle East, and we're trying throughout all our operations to try the best to fulfill our role and mandate. But again, it is very much a situation that in scale and complexity has reached a level of difficulty that we've not seen for a very, very long time.
Philip, based on the limitations now that you mentioned and the difficulty of some situations, difficulties that make also more difficult the role, the bridging role of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And these difficulties mean that sometimes the International Committee of the Red Cross cannot deliver its tasks. And this brings disappointment to the wider public. My question would be, what should be the message in these cases that the International Committee of the Red Cross should deliver to the wider public, which has a trust sometimes. Sometimes the International Committee of the Red Cross is the only trust and the only hope for some people to see their beloved persons. So how do you think the organization should face such crisis, which ultimately is a crisis in the credibility of the organization? Should we stress to the wider public the organization's limitations, or should the organization recoil to a lower profile function, or maybe another venue you would like to point out?
Well, look, I mean, we are often pointed out sometimes when tasks that we would be mandated for, or where one would very much expect that us with our particular profile as a kind of a neutral intermediary role, dealing with the most difficult situations, when we do not succeed, putting blame on us. I mean, I think a difficulty that has occurred, I think that's for humanitarian operations worldwide very much, is that there is a large difficulty that there are great expectations in the public communication sphere and in public, while most of the things we do are trying confidentially, trustful, to establish relations, to negotiate outcomes. So there's a strong tension between sort of public expectation and then the actual work one is trying to do to overcome the issues. And then, of course, if for a specific situation we do not succeed, this tension becomes much higher, and it is difficult to explain. But on the other hand, one has to always be very, very cautious in what one says publicly. Between two sides, usually you say something, you get slapped on the one side. If you say something else, you're slapped by the other. So often a measure of success is when you're equally slapped on all sides. But I think generally, and that's not just for the ICRC, it's for all organizations. I mean, dealing with in a good way with social media has become a much bigger challenge. I think if one speaks to journalists, they also face this phenomenon, particularly if there are misrepresentations or even if there are situations where one could see political interference. I mean, those are more difficult points to judge. But I can just assure that, I mean, we try within all the means that we have, to make inroads to overcome, the most difficult humanitarian dilemmas. Often it does not happen with the pace and the speed that one would hope for. And one has to, of course, also understand the strong disappointment of persons who are directly, effective, and understand as well these emotions. But I do not believe actually that for these types of situations you're referring to, that it is a question of replacing the role of the ICRC. I think that many of the prerogatives we had are prerogatives that were agreed upon, in the post-Second World War era, prerogatives that would be extremely difficult to obtain in interstate negotiation these days. So I believe that the right answer is seeking as widely as possible from states parties to treaties, but from all others to actually keep pushing to help and support the ICRCs in its endeavors. I think that should be the best approach.
Philip, in cases we have states or other non-state actors which show mistrust towards the International Committee of the Red Cross, how do you think the organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, should try to engage with these situations, trying maybe to exert political pressure to belligerent parties, maybe through education around the world on the role of the organization, maybe through recourse to the social media that you mentioned, or other means?
Well, I think in general, education is very important. I think in all countries, educating about what is international humanitarian law, the role of national societies, Red Crosses and Red Crescents, the ICRC, the neutrality, the uses of emblems, all these things are very, very important to gain understanding. I mean, the other element, of course, with around the world is also states parties to the conventions, making sure that there is an understanding that an organization like ours, with its specific role, has the prerogative and the necessity actually to speak to all actors, and that should not be anything that is seen as bad or something that should be criminalized. I think that is important. Then another part is the role we ourselves, ICRC, need to carry out to engage with non-state armed groups as well. I think maybe for the knowledge for those listening in, I think that at the current state, I think the ICRC engages with more than 350 non-state armed groups around the world. And that's actually quite important because we probably have 100 million people on this planet currently living in territories that are actually not in control of governments, but of non-state armed group entities, and probably the double figure of areas where these groups exert an important part of control. So in order to carry out the task, one needs to seek acceptance and understanding for one's role. And for that, I think it needs the wider support from all states, parties to the treaties. Maybe one last remark would also be that very often in conflicts of today, states also work with or other partners, sometimes non-state armed groups in different contexts. And there I would also say that there is a responsibility for those acting through other actors as well to exert their influence, that those actors behave in correspondence with the norms and values that the government that engages with them stands for and is bound by international humanitarian law.
Yes, Philip, you raised now a very important issue, the fact that in essence modern conflicts are more complicated than maybe conflicts in the past. You spoke about the fact that non-state actors can act under the umbrella of a state entity. And my next question would be about the challenges of modern warfare and maybe the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross in addressing the challenges. The first question of the two refers also to a terminology that is being widely heard nowadays, AI, artificial intelligence. In the realms of warfare, we speak about autonomous weapons, we speak about robots. And my question is, how much is the International Committee of the Red Cross ready to engage with scenarios where the warriors will be not human beings, but machines?
Well, thank you for this question. I think as an introduction, I think that all those listening should be aware that the ICRC from the first moments from when it was created in 1863, then with the creation of the first Geneva Convention in 1864 for the protection of wounded soldiers in the field. We have played a role actually over the past 160 years with the experience in the field in looking at new developments in warfare and trying to see how this the existing law corresponds to it and where there might be needs to develop the law further to address these modern challenges. And indeed, nowadays, if one points out to a few, there is, of course, the topic of robots, automatic weapons, and particularly the questions, when they are automated, where does one still have human responsibility, the human in the loop, to be able to control the accountability of the use of such weapons. And if you go further to artificial intelligence and compound that with it, it raises again another difficulty. I mean, if you look, for example, now in most recent warfare, one can see through artificial intelligence that you have systems that help military decision makers, detecting targets, looking at all kinds of sources of information, and using these technologies in the designation of targets. But then again, you would have in these decision-making processes many questions that would arise. I mean, what are the algorithms? What is the time that then the human being, when it receives this information, to really ensure that this fully complies with the law, the proportionality, the distinction, and all the precautions that need to be taken in this? I mean, these are questions that are arising now and need to be analyzed very, very careful to make sure that we're not reaching a situation where these technologies could be used in breach or actually creating in violation of the treaty. So I think a lot of thought has to go into this and analyzing these systems very carefully. And I think AI is just one element to it. It can, of course, in many instances, also be a tool to help to comply better. But of course, there's also the great risks as well that in the use of such technology, it could actually not be helpful in securing compliance with international humanitarian law. So those are key issues. The third one would probably be a big domain, of course, is all the issue related to cyber warfare. I could also expand on that if you wish.
Yes, cyber warfare indeed, it's linked with, of course, with artificial intelligence. My question would be, do you see the International Committee of the Red Cross intervening in the whole discussion through a commentary, for example?
Well, there is no, there's no project now on integrating that, in some new commentary. But I do think that all these questions, for example, we do have a permanent work undergoing, actually in collaboration with the British Red Cross here. It's the updating of our customary law study. So where new issues arise, even in that sphere, and we observe, state practice or evolving practice. I mean, these are things that we carefully take note of. But I think that where such discussions take place are in all the fora where these takes place, in the discussions or in the working groups around certain conventional weapons. But even outside of that, we take position. So we clearly, wherever debates are out there around these issues, we would make our positions known. Maybe for your interest as well, or all listening, the ICRC just in the past weeks released a report which we call our Challenges Report, Challenges to International Humanitarian Law. It's a report we issue every 4 years ahead of the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which just took place last week. And in that report, you would really find our latest thinking, particularly around these evolving topics.
Philip, you mentioned before all the endeavors of the International Committee of the Red Cross when it comes to artificial intelligence. The second big topic of our times is the augmenting role of private companies in the public sphere of warfare. We know, for example, that non-state actors actually engage into contracts in order to acquire weapons, but also states, when they acquire weapons, these contracts are under private law. And we know also the privatization of warfare through the companies, the Iraq president, when it comes to the United States. My question would be, how much do you think that this augmenting role of private law in warfare is a threat, is a challenge for the purity of the legal status and the legal arrangement of warfare? And how does the International Committee of the Red Cross address the issue?
Well, yeah, very interesting question, and I have to sort of just share my first thoughts. Actually, personally, I was very much, as a former legal director of the ICRC, involved in a process. I think we ended around 2010. It was an initiative where we had, I think it was 15, 16 states that came together and issued what they called a Montreux document. And that's what related to private military and security companies. And, meanwhile, many other states have signed up to that kind of document. And that was, at that time, it was very much looking at the phenomenon, and you can remember Iraq war, of private military and security companies arising, and then trying to restate what is the law and what should best practices be. Now, what you are mentioning is not now just private military and security companies, but it is right, big businesses supplying of arms. The area that we have been looking at very carefully is, for example, relating to cyber warfare, or cyber warfare, where many companies they provide the tools and the means for those engaging, for example, in cyber warfare. But you also have private individuals, hackers who might be engaging in that topic, or you have even private individuals who on the battlefield will be typing in things into their phones and alerting about certain situations. I think one of the concerns, I think the broader concern is a difficult word to pronounce, is like the civilianization of armed conflict. To what extent, if private companies or private individuals engage with it, when is the moment when they pass sort of the threshold, when they're actually sort of directly participating in hostilities? That's actually a dangerous moment, because that makes you sort of part of it, and ultimately even targetable. Now, I'm not trying to suggest, to any kind of specific situation, but if you bring all these elements too close to the battleground and do not remain distinctions where you're passing that threshold, it does pose a real challenge in the sense that you do not want civilians to be drawn in and possibly being part of it and possibly even targetable. So, I mean, these distinctions have been very very important, and one has to, of course, make sure that they are not blurred over time. Now, with the way things are evolving, I think there is, of course, a concern, and that's why one has to try intellectually very sharply to see where this could become very problematic or where risks arise, and all sides are very, very aware of the risks that they are taking with regard to this topic.
Philip, you spoke before when we spoke about the Geneva Conventions. You mentioned the Geneva Conventions. We are 100 years since the enactment of the first Geneva Convention. And at that time, we know that the role of the non-state actors was very much prominent. Nowadays, we see states actually maybe being the first fiddle in the orchestra of international relations. Do you think that the pendulum has shifted towards states? And do you think it's a positive, negative, neutral consequence of the way that international relations develop?
Well, I wouldn't agree. If you look back 160 years, it was a small group of states that came together for the adoption of the first Geneva Conventions, and the number of states that have signed up meanwhile is at the level that it's universal. I mean, you have every state in the world has signed up to these treaties, and with that, Article 1 of the treaty says they need to respect and ensure respect for it. So that is actually something very important. I would just say that a worry one has these days, of course, is when one looks at the sort of geopolitical rifts and tensions, is that very strongly the multilateral system is more under threat. There are big divisions, and that, of course, does not really help sometimes to have the required consensus, to push through positions, particularly if one sees that some states or others are not complying. That is maybe one worry. I do not know, if there were more or less non-state armed groups, but I would say that if you look at the conflictuality, I think there was a statement by an ICRC president 25 years ago where he was referring to 25 situations of armed conflict. Nowadays, the ICRC qualifies 120 situations where IHL applies. So there has, over the past years, been quite a proliferation of situations of armed conflict. But also, if you look more carefully, there are many situations where conflicts are protracted, are lasting for a long time. And the longer it lasts, the more it fractionalizes. You have more non-state armed groups, and frankly, the situation becomes a lot messier and difficult to handle. I mean, a case in point would be what is currently happening in the absolutely tragic situation in Sudan as well, where yes, you have two main parties in the conflict fighting each other, but the longer it lasts, you can see how it factions, and then you have more and more armed groups to engage with, and then it becomes very, very difficult as well then to engage, secure the required security for humanitarian workers, and much more difficult to bring this this puzzle back together again. So in that sense, I think yes, we do have a situation as well where currently we have a very, very high number of non-state armed grouped entities, and which makes, of course, all our work so much more challenging.
Philip, if we can close with a note of more optimism, since unfortunately warfare is by definition an area that creates only chaos and pain. Do you see, we spoke before about the challenges when it comes to the international humanitarian law and the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross in mitigating these challenges, but in a kind of trying to impart on a very kind of more optimistic note, do you see any opportunities in the development of international humanitarian law in the future?
Well, no, I mean, frankly speaking, of course, one has new developments, technological and other developments that has happened throughout history, and one had to grapple with them and find solutions to bring that. So I think that is a challenge that comes with the times, and we have to put our minds and the energies to it, to tackle that. So that is for me nothing unusual. I would say these days, of course, when one watches news and looks around, there is sort of a feeling of doom one hears often, but I think that is typically the time where one does not stick one's head in the sand, but rather where all, and particularly also, those listening, young lawyers, young professionals in our trade are actually called to not to fall into slumber, but actually really fight for these common values. I mean, humanitarian law is a real civilizatory acquis. It's something that was acquired and that needs to be defended. And I think it's more a question now of very, very much mobilizing around these topics and upping our efforts. So I would think that if we all, pull our share in trying to address these challenges, we have to be optimistic. And so again, it's really more a call to action. And in that sense, I think if we actually all do that, then we can be optimistic.
Philip, thank you very much for this interview. Ladies and gentlemen, it was Dr. Philip Sperry from the International Committee of the Red Cross here in London. We bid you farewell, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the BUL Emerging Law Voices series.